Hello, hello. Richard Lowton's here, and Lowton said I got the wrong title. What title do I have? Hold on. No, what was the title then? It's supposed to be Isobel Gowdie of the Hedge in History. I'm confused. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway. There's something going screwy between my YouTube and my Streamlabs streaming software. It did it on Tuesday as well, but it still picks up the correct live. I don't know what's going on, so I'm just going to get through this week, and then I'll schedule the next week and just see if it's sorted itself out. 'Cause it's fucking annoying. Anyway, all right. So let me pull up my notes over here. Um, so today is Hedge in History. We are going to Auldearn in Scotland, and it's April the 13th, 1663. Sorry, 1662. So there's a farmer's wife walks in front of the local minister and a handful of commissioners, and without laying anyone or without anyone laying a hand on her, she starts to talk. And what comes out of her mouth over the next 6 weeks, across four actual separate sessions, is one of the strangest documents in the entire history of European witchcraft. Coven of 13, a pact sealed at the kirk at midnight, shape-shifting into a hare with a specific little rhyme you had to get exactly right, feasts inside a hollow hill ruled by the Queen of Fairies herself, arrows made by elves that could kill a man from across a field. So this is Isobel Gowdie. You're going to understand why historians have spent 350 years arguing about what on earth she was actually describing. All right. Psycat's here. Hello, Psycat. Thanks for joining. So let's start at Auldearn. This is a small parish in Nainshire, up on the Murray Firth in the Scottish Highlands. Not the Highlands of clans and claymores, popular imagination, but lowland flavoured farming country, close enough to the coast to feel the restoration politics of Edinburgh, but far enough to have its own texture of belief. Isobel Gowdie was married to a farmer named John Gilbert. That's genuinely most of what we know about her life before 1662. There's no birth record survives, no birth records that survived. There's no clear age, nothing about children or anything like that. She just enters the historical record essentially at the moment she starts confessing. And 1662 is not a random year to be confessing witchcraft in Scotland. The country had just come just come through the upheaval of the Covenanting War and the Cromwellian occupation, and with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, local authorities were suddenly re-empowered to go after all sorts of things that had been in limbo, including granting local commissions to witchcraft cases without needing sign-off from Edinburgh's central courts every time. So I just need to switch over here because I've got myself appearing on three different screens. It's very distracting. So that bureaucratic loosening is a big part of why 1661 to 1662 produced one of the largest witch hunting waves in Scottish history, sometimes called the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1661 to 1662, with hundreds of people named, accused, and in a great many cases executed. Gowdie's confession happens right in the middle of a panic. So in a huge number of Scottish witch trials from this period, we know torture was standard operating procedure. Not always the rack, but things like sleep deprivation, waking the accused for days on end, and witch pricking, where a professional pricker would search the body for the devil's mark, which is usually a spot that supposedly wouldn't bleed or feel pain when it's pierced. In Grim, it's grim, it's coercive by design, and it produces exactly the kind of confession you'd expect, whatever the interrogators wanted to hear. Now, Isobel Gowdie's confessions have no surviving records of any of that. All right. As far as the documents tell us, she walked in and volunteered it. 4 sessions, which happened on April the 13th, May the 3rd, May the 15th, and May the 27th of 1662. Recorded by a local minister whose name was Harry Forbes, and a set of commissioners. And each one gets more detailed and more elaborate than the last. Like she's warming up rather than actually being worn down. And that's genuinely rare in this material, and it's the single biggest reason her case gets treated differently from run-of-the-mill panic testimony. When torture produces a confession, historians read it as a document of coercion. When a confession like this shows up seemingly uncoerced, historians have to ask a much harder question. What was she actually doing and why? But we'll come back to that question because it's actually the real spine of the whole story. But first, let's get into what she actually said because it's worth savoring. This is some of the richest folk magical material to survive from the entire early modern period. So Gowdie says she was recruited into a coven about 15 years before her confession, so sometime in the mid-1640s, by a woman meeting her on the road. The initiation itself happened at Kirk of Auldearn at night, and it followed an all too popular pattern. She renounced her baptism, and the devil marked her on the shoulder, sucking blood from the spot with his mouth, which was then used, she said, to sprinkle on her head in a kind of inverted baptism of his own. And the devil she describes is a specific figure. She calls him, in her own Scots, a meikle black rochman, which means, translates to a big black rough man. Ice cold to the touch, cloven feet which he sometimes hid inside shoes so people wouldn't necessarily notice at a glance. He has sex with the women of the coven, which she describes as painful and unpleasant rather than seductive. This isn't a romanticized encounter, it's closer to an ordeal. He gives each witch a new name. Gowdie's was Janet. Every coven, she says, has a maiden, being a young woman, given a place of honor and made the devil's particular favorite. And Gowdie describes her own coven's maiden as well. And that number, by the way, 13, comes directly from her testimony. She describes her coven explicitly as a group of 13, and this confession is actually one of the earliest and most influential sources for the idea that a coven is specifically a group of 13, an idea that gets picked up centuries later and becomes almost gospel in 20th century witchcraft revival circles, Wicca included. And if you've ever heard someone actually say a coven has to be 13 members, you can trace a meaningful chunk of that belief back to this one farmer's wife in Nainshire. So let me just have a sip of me coffee. So Gowdie describes the coven flying to their meetings, not on broomsticks, which is kind of the image most of us kind of default to, but on corn straws or on horses conjured from straw and rushes, which you'd throw between your legs and while shouting horse and haddock in the devil's name. And once airborne, they'd fly into people's houses through the windows and feast on the best food and drink in the place. She's specifically, or she's specific that they'd eat their fill and then leave the rest tasting foul or spoiled afterward, and then fly back out before anyone actually woke. And then there's the shape shifting, which might be the single most quoted piece of the whole confession. Gowdie gives an actual verse, a working chant for turning into a hare. I'm not. I should have actually maybe taken the actual Scottish English words here and put them on the screen, but it's a bit late now. So I'm just going to give you the translation of it. So it roughly means, I shall go into a hare with sorrow and sighing and much care, and I shall go in the devil's name until I come home again. And crucially, she gives the counter chant too, the actual words to turn back from a hare into a woman. And that level of procedural detail, not just I turn into a hare, but the actual liturgy for doing it, both directions, is almost unheard of in the trial records. The most confessions under duress produce vague admissions. This reads like someone reciting a piece of oral tradition they'd actually practiced, or at least deeply internalized anyway. She also describes turning into other animals, such as a jackdaw and cats. And there's a wonderful, slightly comic detail in the record where she claims one of her fellow witches botched the transformation chant and got stuck partway between woman and hare, which is kind of a kind of specific, almost embarrassing texture you don't get from a scripted, coerced confession. It reads like folklore. It reads like a story people actually told each other. And then, woven through all of this material with no sense of contradiction, is an entire parallel world of fairy lore. Now, Gowdie describes visiting Downey Hill, which is a fairy mound, where she says she was taken inside to meet the Queen of Elphame, or the Queen of Fairies, who she describes as a beautiful woman bravely clothed in white linen, who fed her and treated her well. This is a real geographically specific place near Auldearn, which grounds the fantastical claim in an actual local landmark her listeners would have recognized. Now, inside the hill, she says, elf boys work at fashioning what she calls elf arrows. These are small flint arrowheads, and this is this part is actually true regardless of what you believe about the rest of it. But it's actually real archaeological objects. Now, prehistoric flint arrowheads turn up in Scottish fields constantly, and by the 17th century, folk belief across Scotland and Ireland widely held that these were fairy weapons, used to actually injure or kill livestock and people from a distance without leaving a visible wound, which conveniently explained any sudden illness or death that a physician of the time couldn't otherwise account for. And Gowdie claims she and her coven used elf arrows shot by the devil himself, while the coven knelt and echoed his aim to kill on his command. This blending is really the whole reason Gowdie's confession stands out from the European witch trial canon. Most confessions, especially contention or continental ones, shaped by texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, stick to a fairly rigid demonological script: pact, Sabbath, maleficium, and done. Now, Gaudie's testimony sits the demonic pact right alongside pre-Christian, distinctly Scottish and Gaelic fairy belief, with no sense that that these are two different systems. To her, apparently, they were just one world. Which then brings us back to the big question. If nobody tortured this out of her, why did she say all of it? And also in such a loving, specific detail. Historians have landed in a few different camps here. Some read it the way you'd read any coerced confession, just without the physical marks. Social and religious pressure in the middle of a witch panic can produce compliance without a single formal torture session, especially for a woman who may have been already marginal in her community. Others point to the sheer narrative craft of it and wonder if Gowdie was, in a sense, a gifted storyteller who found herself with an audience desperate to hear exactly this kind of material and gave them a masterpiece. But the theory I find most compelling, and it's the one most associated with the historian Emma Wilby, who wrote an entire book on this case, The Visions of Isobel Gowdie, um, is that we might be looking at something closer to a genuine visionary or shamanistic tradition. Wilby's argument is that cunning folk and folk magic practitioners across early modern Britain sometimes described trance states, spirit journeys, and encounters with fairies as real, lived experiences within their own practice. Not performance and not pure invention, but something closer to what anthropologists would recognize from shamanic traditions worldwide. Under that reading, Gaudi wasn't confabulating a demonic fantasy to satisfy her interrogators. She may have been describing, in the only religious vocabulary available to her, a vocabulary that fused the devil of the Kirk with the fairy queen of older belief. Actual visionary experiences from a folk magical practice she'd been part of for years. That's genuinely different, that's a genuinely different way of reading this whole document, and it lands somewhere very close to the Margaret Murray territory we kind of covered back in the Devil of the Craft episode. I think that was last week. The idea that what the courts called the devil might, at the level of the actual accused person's lived belief, have been something much older and much less satanic. Murray's specific witch cult theory doesn't hold up as literal organized religion history, but Gaudí's testimony is a good example of why that theory had so much emotional pull in the first place. Read her confession and you don't come away thinking Satanist. You come away thinking you've stumbled onto a fragment of something folkloric and very old, wearing 17th century Christian clothes because that was the only vocabulary on offer. Starting to trip up my own words. A bit more coffee, shall we? Just in case. Then we get to the really interesting part, or maybe slightly disturbing, actually. We don't know what happened to her. After the fourth confession on May 27th, 1662, the record simply stops. There's no surviving trial verdict, no execution record, no release document. There's absolutely nothing. Given the climate of 1662 and the fact that self-confessed, unretracted witchcraft almost always ended in execution in Scotland at this time, most historians lean toward the assumption that she was strangled and burned, the standard method, sometime around mid-July of that year. But it's entirely possible the record simply didn't survive, rather than that it never existed. We are left with one of the most vivid, most quoted witch confessions in European history, and a total blank where the ending should actually be. So that's Isobel Gowdie, a farmer's wife from Nairnshire, who, for reasons we will probably never fully untangle, sat down 4 times in 6 weeks and handed history an almost novelistic account of covens and fairy hills and hare-shaped rhymes without anyone apparently forcing a word out of it out of her. Coerced performance, genuine visionary folk practice, or something in between. I don't think we get to know for certain, but I think that uncertainty is exactly why she's remembered and quoted and puzzled over 360 plus years later, when so many other confessions from the same panic have been forgotten. Absolutely fascinating woman. I do recommend getting Emma Welby's book. It's just fascinating, really is. Angelo's here. Hello, hello. Yeah, I do enjoy. I'm not really a history buff myself. I don't really enjoy actual history, but looking into these people that our modern witchcraft kind of develops out of does get quite fascinating. Um, so I do like it, but just not. I'm not much for dates and numbers really and names. So, but anyway. Right. Next week, we're going to go back to practice again next week. So I'm kind of switching practice and then a person in history. So next week, I want to have a look at scrying and divination from folk witchcraft perspective, anyway. Right, and that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time, or I'll see you on Sunday, hopefully. Until then, have a good one, and cheers for now. Thanks for joining and watching as well. Really appreciated. Cheerio. Oh, and it's Nicole Green. Hello, thanks for joining. Cheers.